Well, thank you, Jen, for such a gracious introduction, and thanks everyone for taking their morning today and providing me an opportunity to present some of the work. It was really exciting getting to go to the Santa Fe CSSA conference. I'd heard good things about it from my colleagues, so I was looking forward to attend and was not disappointed. Really great structure. Today, I want to talk about sort of this social complexity. As you mentioned in my bio, how we're sort of modeling how do we simulate social complexity, just to kind of clear some of the bellwether works. Some of this work has been funded in part by Project Mead, that was out of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Low Intensity Conflicts and Special Operations, and also from a SIBR with the Marine Corps Warfighting Analysis Centers. But not all of this work. This work began as part of my master's and then through my PhD, but it has received some fundings. I want to give a shout out to my co-authors and contributors, KJ Oviette, Valeria Stevens, and Erica Palmer, who is up at Cornell. So what we're talking today is these generic structures of social complexity, and I want to kind of make sure that, because I know CSSA has a lot of agent-based models. There was a quote that was given at the start of the CSSA conference that anything that's not an agent-based model is just a cheap bastardization of what otherwise would have been a great agent-based model. So we do system dynamics, and this is probably maybe routine for all of you to understand the system dynamics, because there's a lot of crossover, and I'm not one of these ones who gets into camp fights of which is better than not. I was just sort of poking some fun. But there were some questions at the conference of like, how are you doing this fundamentally? Or is it network theory or graph theory? So these are some of the defining characteristics of a system dynamics models that we published last year, really more for a lay audience, so it may be more refresher. But just these models are kind of like physics systems. We're doing continuous time, delays are foundational. We're using an analysis based on feedback loops, and we're trying to look at that accumulation delay. So that's just how this simulation, as you see this simulation, keep in the back of your mind that that's how we're approaching it. So why are we developing these socio-technical structures at micro, meso, and macro layers? Well, our stakeholders are asking this, right? So whenever you're doing it, and I noticed Chris mentioned he was with MITRE with the wargaming. We're doing research on wargames now, and one of our stakeholder questions is, look, you got a wargame. How do you integrate micro representations of social populations, individuals, very small groups, with macro and meso simultaneously and do it in a rigorous way? And then when we were working with the Marine Corps, the Warfighting Analysis Center, that's a SIBR, they were saying, look, we want you to do this work, civilian population modeling for civilian military operations. We want you to do it with real theory, real data, and instantiate it for any region in the world. And don't assume the government's going to hand you some magic data behind the screen and some sort of classified. Go out and do these things yourself. So we're really trying to not to take theory that is well established, link it to real world data, and then use those in simulations to create these simulations that can be used to explore this. So in our socio-technical structure, we break things down into several pieces. The first micro is demographics. We're looking at who are they, how old are they, where are they. The second is social identity. What are they doing in a daily pattern of life? How does that social identity, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, determine where they're going and how they're moving around? That's the micro level. At the meso level, we're combining these into civilian segments. What ethnographic or slice? We'll get into this again. When we say civilian segment, that could be an ethnographic slice, a political slice, a regional variation slice. We can do it in a lot of different ways in these models. Sentiment, what are they thinking and how are they feeling? And specifically here, we're looking at their sense of legitimacy and affiliation with state and non-state actors or other large groups in the area, maybe international actors. And gets into that affiliation. How does that perception of be very broad? We'll talk about some specific examples and show how I represent. But just this is our social technical structure that we're going to go over. And finally, the macro, right? We're dealing when we generally build these models, it's a 10-year simulation of either a country or a theater or a region. So it may be two countries. We'll talk about some of the different use cases we've used this on. But the macro is how do all of these interact simultaneously? So everything we're going through is present in the model and simultaneously being tracked and interacted. So you can look at it and slice it any way you want. All of these are put in what's called the emerging state actor model. This is the model that Jin mentioned was some of my earlier work working on emerging state actor theory. These are sectors of the model. There's about 15 sectors in all, and it models left of bang asymmetric conflict. So these are not conventional warfare. It's everything to the left of that. So it could be everything from nonviolent protest and civil resistance that's nonviolent up to violence and sort of both state and non-state violence, clandestine terror networks. It smoothly transitions left and right up to insurgencies and even emerging state actor conflicts like we had with ISIS. So we're not modeling, for example, true conventional warfare like what's going on in Ukraine right now, but we might be modeling some scenarios to the left or right of that, as we'll talk about. Again, it's a 10-year simulation. So we're doing daily calculations. What's happening every single day in this model over 10 years to look at very broad effects. Because of that, we're not doing precise predictions. We're not saying Thursday, 15 years from now, something's going to happen. We're looking at the trends over time. It was developed initially to work with counter ISIS. So we're using this in Syria and Iraq, the 15 sectors, and the four playable actors. You think about a war game, right? The simulation has four sides. There's the green and the red. The green is the local state actor, the red is the local non-state actor. The two foreigns are sort of aggregated. The blue is the foreign actor that's supporting the green, and the purple is the foreign actor or coalition that's supporting the red. So you've got four sides interacting. And there's a lot going on in the model, but what we're focusing on today with this social identity and micro, meso, macro is really these three sectors on the right that deal with civilian patterns of life, civilian sentiments, and civilian affiliations. So just this model was built in 2014, right when ISIS was breaking out in the Anbar. It was actually a little bit before. 2013 was the first version, but 2014 when it broke out with the Anbar offensive. Published originally in 2018, it got caught in a systemic review. And part of this motivation for doing this work came from a review. And this review also included, if you want to check it out, it includes, I heard these names come up in the conference. I guess these are agent-based model. So it's in the same category as Rebel Land and Civil Violence, which are, I guess, two fairly well-known agent-based models. But what they called out for us is they said, look, you got all these things. It's great. It's nice, but you don't have social identity. That's what that SI is. So part of our motivation is to fill the gap here in this. This is an updated version. Um, what scenarios? This gets into the use case to kind of get again, the Marine Corps Warfighting Center. They said that's great, you did it in ISIS, that's Syria and Iraq. You were able to model that, but we want to know that this can be used anywhere in the world. So pick some examples and some scenarios that aren't just counterinsurgency, counter ISIS kind of operations. That were where it's original. Let's look at it. So one of it was as an experiment. Remember, we're left of bang, so we don't do conventional. So we took a hypothetical that said, what if a hypothetical ceasefire was declared on the current line of control in December 2022 in the Ukraine conflict? I'm not saying I'm advocating that policy. I'm just saying this was the experiment we ran. And then from that, we say the green is Ukraine, the blue is NATO and the EU, red is the separatist provinces, purple is Russia, and our civilian segments. This shows how we can split civilian segments differently. In the counter ISIS model, the civilian segments were language and religion, Arab Sunni, Arab Shia, Kurdish Sunni. In the Ukraine, it's language and ethnic identity. So Ukrainian speaking Ukrainians, Russian speaking Ukrainians, and Russian speaking Russians. And you can do a lot more, but we're sort of narrowing it down to these three. And post conflict, we're looking at what happens when the conventional war ends and we go forward under scenario for the next 10 years, and there's a counterfactual fork. In the details of the experiment is Russia's going to have a garrison force in the separatists that's supposed to leave after 3 years, and we do a counterfactual fork 3 years out in the future, so 2025 from this experiment that says Russia doesn't leave. What happens then? So we're using these simulations to sort of explore. And then the other one, we wanted a South Asian example. So we did Myanmar, which is currently in a civil war. And this was a futures war game. So imagine you're going to do a war game that says there's a natural disaster and humanitarian aid mission in 2029. There's been a major earthquake and tsunami hitting Myanmar. What are you going to see? How do we prepare this war game given what we know now? And so this is a futures where we started with conditions today and moved in the future to know what the war game might be instantiated with that's run if you're running a futures or capabilities development or something like that. Here, the green is the pro-junta Union Solidarity and Development Party, the USDP. The blue would be the U.S. military providing humanitarian aid. The red is the opposition forces, which is the National League for Democracy plus the ethnic political parties. And the purple is NA, right? So the civilian segments here, now we're using a ethnic plus political split. So Bamar is the majority ethnic population in Myanmar. The first civilian segment is a pro-junta Bamar. The second is an anti-junta Bamar. And then we have the ethnic coalitions as the third. And again, we could split out those because there's a lot of ethnic minorities in Myanmar. I don't want to downplay that, but for this purpose, we kind of consolidated them. So these show the scenarios we've run through experiments. We've also done some with Indonesia and other areas with ESAM. So Um, let's start going through the basis of everything is this sort of micro one and two, demographics and social identity. And social identity, we use this theory. We went to Hoggs and Hornsey. We wanted to base it on real theory. And so social identity is based off three main things. Self-categorization is the sorting process by which people are either ascribed or choose groups. So we wanted to reflect the ability to choose groups. Prototyping is once they're in that group, right? What are the in-group and out-group influences that normalize that group behavior? And there's a common thing that says I may, um, so that I may be a woman is not a choice. I'm a woman born in Ukraine, but I get associated and I get associated with a role, a social identity as I become a woman student in Ukraine. That then the prototyping begins forming how I should act, or if I'm diverging, how I should be punished for not acting that way may cause a shift. And this, we're using this in our theory to say we can categorize people in chunks. And once categorized, they may adjust, but the final one is depersonalization. There's a bit of stickiness here. So there's some resistance to change over time, and you see that as we go through this. In our construction using this theory, your social identity gets formed and it changes over time, but it doesn't change every single day. It's, we've got a 10-year model. People will change, but it's not going to change on a daily basis necessarily. This is the structure. It's a system dynamic structure where we contain the demographics and microsocial. So the micro here is a very simple, this is a standard. By the way, all of these are standard system dynamic structures. They're generic structures. You can find them in the common textbooks of the field. We weren't trying to go out and create brand new structures for the most part. So we broke out, each civilian segment has 20 age cohorts and 5-year segments. We did gender male and female. We can do more genders if we want, but we kept it to 2 here. The second micro is how those, when you take an age and a gender, we're pulling from data. So we pulled from the World Value Survey to see what is these, because they track social identities and they have social roles. What is a 22-year-old man doing in Myanmar of this ethnicity or 22? And we use this age plus gender mix, this slice, to figure out who was a college student, who was a worker, who was an activist, who was a caretaker, who was retired, who was unemployed. And we use these. This is how we split up that population. So it's actually tracking every single person in a country, usually between 40 and 60 million people. But I want to be clear again, system dynamics, not agent-based model. We are not naming Bob and watching Bob grow up as a student to become a college student to become a worker, but we know where everyone is in the population, and we're sort of using this age plus gender to say how many male college age students are there in a given area with a given civilian segment. The data, again, Marine Corps wanted real world data that didn't come from them. So we're using NASA's Earth population statistics to find out where people are. And then we're using the World Value Survey to identify these social identities and characteristics. World Value Survey is a great data source. They do a pulse every 4 years, so it's not necessarily a frequent sample, but they do every 4 years or so, and they get about 160 countries. They've been around for 28 years. So we wanted a group that had some credibility and some duration. We weren't just going to use one study of one country that, maybe never gets replicated again. So the World Value Survey is causing a lot of this data. And in the paper that's associated, it goes a little more into that. So once we have the micro two, the meso is the civilian segment, right? A civilian segment is everyone in one of those slices, regardless of where their individual micro is. So the civilian segment of Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians is all the men and the women, age 0 to 80, who are identified as Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. But within that segment, it includes all those different social identities as well. And again, just to review, these slices are arbitrary based on the purpose of the war game you're modeling or the sociotechnical system. In ISIS, we did language plus religion. In Ukraine, we did ethnicity plus language. In Myanmar, we did ethnicity plus political affiliation. You could do all sorts of slices. In the US, we've done race plus political disposition. You can slice it any way you want as long as you can get that good data. This is what the data looks like. It's a bit of an eyesore of a chart, but I just want to clear it to show how we're pulling this in. On the top is sort of the dashboard. This is the Myanmar. It shows civilian segments. The CS 1, 2, 3 is the anti-junta, pro-junta, and ethnic. And if you're reading down the left, you see we're going through all three civilian segments. And then as you go over, we're going those are our social identity roles. So for civilian segment one, you've got student, college student, worker, caregiver, activist, unemployed, retired. And then as you go across, you have men and then women. and then you have an age cohort across the top. And what these numbers are, these are the percentage of that population in that civilian segment that we then distribute. So we know there's 60 million people in Ukraine. How many of them are distributed in this particular segment is this percentage wise? Well, we know, and then it all has to equal out. So the error check at the bottom is one. World Value Surveys provided these percentages for everything we're doing. However, they didn't track people below the age of 20. So for that, we used UN data. We kind of got the UN data, one of the what are the sustainable development goals. For the broader work, we used UN quite a bit. So those don't always equal 100%, but they're under the age of the majority age of 20. So this shows how we're ingesting. So this is something that the analyst has to prepare. It's manual, but not cumbersome. The first time we did ISIS, it took me weeks to instantiate the model. We did Ukraine, it took a couple days. With Myanmar, it took a couple hours. So once you get a process down, it gets easier and it can be automated. But what does this mean when it all comes together, right? This is where they come together in the socio-technical system. So you see here on the left, we have our three civilian segments get split into two genders, 20 age cohorts. As you go right, those combine into seven types of social roles. So from that, everything to the right gets identified. When I know your social role and I know you're a 20-year-old college student, I know what you need in terms roughly facilities, civil infrastructure, type of civil services. You obviously need education facilities. You might want some entertainment. You might need housing. But if you're a retired 75-year-old, you have a different set of services you need. You might need more medical. You might need more support, things like that. And we can do all this for the some facilities, our physical facilities building. So that's like universities, the structures, things that you can do. Civil infrastructure, that's like plumbing, water, food. I mean, a lot of these models we're trying to track what are the food needs, what's the electrical need, things like that. And then from the far right, we do want to know where they are roughly. So then we use location by type of schedule. If you're a caregiver and you have children, you're going to be dominated by the school week about where you're traveling back and forth. I want to again emphasize this is a system dynamics model. We do not know where any single person by name is and where they're moving in a car like an agent based model, but we know approximately where people are in a given day in our 10-year model. So if something happens, like a terrorist strike happens, we know who's in the area. If likewise, if insurgencies degrade or state actions degrade food service or electrical service, we know who that is impacting and how that, and that gets into this sort of sentiment formation. Um, and so this is the social technical system that we use to build. Again, standards models, nothing fancy there. When we go to sentiment, so now that we've got the population, we're trying to figure out what are they thinking. We're basing this off Turnley's work from 2020, legitimacy theory. And legitimacy is this concept that it's not justice, it's not fairness. It's that if you have a series of credible procedures that you follow time after time, you build legitimacy. That means I know what's going to happen, and the punishment is if I don't follow it, I know. So credible procedures, and that's what that T means. At time one, an institution's delivering procedures. At time two, they're continuing the credible procedures. The population is beginning to understand the left-right boundaries of behavior, and T3. So it's an accumulation. Legitimacy is an accumulation of perception of I know what I need to do in order to exist in this environment. Maybe not thrive, maybe not my ideal situation. That's not, again, not fairness, but legitimacy. And the reason it matters when we're doing these socio-technical systems, whether it's a conflict or even something more domestic, is there's this continuum between legitimacy and power. If someone does not view a state actor as legitimate, they're going to have to be coerced and threatened for every single interaction. This is a transactional, very heavy transactional. I use the example of Hollywood mafia movies, right? They've got to come in every week and threaten the person, hey, pay your extortion money, make sure we do it. We're going to rough up your store, right? After, it's very coercive and it's intensive. It takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of resources. As you shift this dynamic, the split between power and legitimacy, people are beginning to opt in. At the far right of legitimacy, someone may say, hey, here's your envelope of cash. I know the rules. I just pay the cash, right? And that may be an area where the underworld has a more organized presence and is established that legitimacy. So whether it's a state actor, a non-state actor, this concept of legitimacy is very important to track. Where are you in this left-right sentiment? And they're based off fast expectations and slow anchors. and affiliation goes left to right. So on the left of that continuum, where it's more power and less legitimacy, it's coercion. I have to get to you each time. As you move in the middle, it's calculated legitimacy. It's a strategic choice. I'm saying, look, this is my best option for now. I may not like it. I may not be happy with it, but I'm going to play along to get along. And on the right, you're governed. You're fully opted in. That doesn't mean you don't have criticism, you don't have whinges or whines, you're not upset about things, but it means you're operating within the context of being fully governed. Um, and the way these sentiments move is again a very standard system dynamic structure called dual anchor sentiment adjustment, which is an expectation of a fast anchor that moves quickly. Think of these as gear, a fast gear and then a slow gear. And how that looks in a structure is you've got the fast expectation. This is an anchor that moves on a period of 6 months. Every 6 months, it's kind of operating in this time cycle. And what it's looking at is the things I experience day to day, service delivery. Remember back when I said in the socio-technical, electricity, power, water, food, right? Civil services, right? Because remember, state actors can deny one civilian segment services while propping another up. This captures that because within this structure is all of those different civilian segments. So these anchors, these gears are simultaneously moving for every civilian segment we've made. And that means I can have something. You take an American example, you might look back in the 20th century, the government can be denying services to black populations while providing them to white populations, and you're going to have different sentiments because of that. So the service delivery is one aspect in the short term. Information operations, everything from social media, all the classic things you can put in here, celebrities, influencers, politicians, it's kind of aggregated in here. It comes from another part of the model we can, that's outside the scope of this discussion. So obviously sentiment is based on what I'm hearing, right? General levels of violence. This is an important one to understand for conflict zones. Even if you're not experiencing the violence, you get nervous when there's violence in your area. So general levels of violence. Um, but the slow anchor, this is the anchor that takes years to develop, and it's a much slower anchor. And this is where directly experienced violence is the main thing. If you have got a personal experience with violence yourself, your family, your friends, someone who lived to you next door that you knew, this can really hit the slow anchor. And the way these two work together is that these are what control the affiliation change. So we take the percent that view the population, the actor as legitimate. Amen. Right, four actors: state, non-state, foreign supporting the state, foreign supporting the non-state. So all of these are simultaneously operating in the model. But I look at what is the percent that view as legitimate. It's the people with the long-term sentiment divided to the total people controlling the actor. So back in the model, we know what actor is controlling what population, and we can divide in who's viewing it, who's viewing best choice to now. And these are what will change the affiliation. But what this allows us to do is now we start to get in some velocity calculations. So what is the relative momentum? People don't have, I pull from the classic agent base, right? Don't have perfect calculators in their heads. Agents are not out there calculating all this stuff. So we're trying to get to what is a relative momentum perception? Who's better for me right now? What have you done for me lately is kind of what we're trying to get to with this relative momentum. And we do it simply by taking the average of change in calculated legitimacy, and then the rate of change in the average of change. And that gives us a comparison. So now we have the ability to kind of get a heuristic for the agents in the model to say, how are they viewing these actors? I mean, we have very precise calculations in the model, but that's not how people think. So we're trying to get a more heuristic perception of when they're thinking about who's doing better for me now, we have this relative perceived momentum between the two actors. And what that does is it moves things left and right. So this is the one structure that is built kind of custom, but it is just a material aging chain, right? It's a material chain and I'll go through again, we'll zoom in a little bit here to see, but think of this as a series of stocks or bathtubs or however you want to describe it, where the population for any civilian segment, each civilian segment is split amongst all four of those boxes for each actor. So if you're an Arab Sunni and you're under the control of Syria and Iraq, your population is going to be split between these four boxes. It will be distributed. It's not all in one, it's not all in the other, but it's split. If you're an Arab Sunni under the control of ISIS, you're in a similar structure, but you have different values of where the population is split. So this left to right movement on the material chain actually matches this legitimacy and power that we're pulling from theory. So this is just taking the theory and representing it in a structure. And on the far right, and again, we're going from right to left. This is full legitimacy or govern. These are the people who fully opt in. So if let's take an example of Russia, right? These are the ones, if you're talking just Russian speaking Russians, just that civilian segment, right? The ones who are, and this is the state actor, right? So the ones who are full legitimacy govern, this might be the 20% who support Putin enthusiastically. They're all in. They are gung ho. They're, nationalists perhaps. They got it. They're with it. They're part of the plan. But you've got this much larger segment now that's calculated legitimacy. These are, say, the 60% of Russian speaking Russians who are there to, like, look, I just want to be left alone. I want to live my life. Putin's the guy in charge. I get that. I'm not trying to make waves. But you now have a population split, and it will move dynamically left and right. And then you have the coerced civilian segment. This might, let's and just say again, taking the Russian example, this might be the Navalny opposition who, kind of spurred up in 2018, 2019, sort of got repressed. But this might be the 20% who are really against the Putin regime and feel that they're being coerced. Well, when you have this distribution in stocks, everything else in the model that we might want to find out can be done. If you're governed, right, you pay more taxes, you comply, you take less police to garrison, you support more recruits to the military. Anything you can talk about what are the characteristics that govern do, and you can change that. That calculated legitimacy may pay different rates in taxes, or maybe a little less compliance, a little more shadiness. They may be less willing to volunteer, and certainly coerced. You may not be able to extract anything but criminal revenue. So with ISIS, for example, when we're modeling this with ISIS, they didn't have a lot of, when they started, they were getting criminal extortation, blood money, kidnappings, things like that, selling, stealing cars. But as they formed governmental structures, emerging state actor, that legitimacy, again, not saying fair or just, but it moved people to calculate legitimacy that says, look, I just don't want to get killed. So I don't want to get in that justice square. So I want to understand what I need to do to survive. And this is where ISIS literally began collecting taxes. They could charge taxes to business and get a revenue source. So the purpose of this model is not to have really fancy structures, but to capture this kind of change in sentiment and affiliation based on these different social identities. And then the last one is unaligned. If you have coerced population, but you can't garrison them, they're going to opt out and go to a different actor. Um, Again, we're using primary flows. It's a material aging change. All of these conservation of mass is important. At no point can you have more people in the country than you started with, were born minus who died. You got to maintain that. And we're using primary flows. So the goal gap sentiments, this is where those changes in sentiment, this is where it adjusts what the left to right flow is. And you go from now the premise of this is that you don't go from fully governed to coerce. You have to go through calculated legitimacy. But that can happen fairly quickly. It doesn't happen over a slow period of time. Um, so the secondary flows are everything else. This is, again, it's a model that we're using for a wide variety of things. So if you conquer territory, you gain that population. It flows out of the coerced and into the calculated legitimacy, or excuse me, into the coerced and you've got to do it. So when you conquer a population, you have to move them up to the right if you want to get them to a legitimate status. It might have deaths, refugees. We model anomalous violence events. We model irregular warfare. In the Myanmar, we model a disaster. But there's also refugees, people leaving the area. So you can model ethnic cleansing with this. You can model migration, not migration patterns in a broad sense, but more reactions to things in the immediate area that might cause people to leave. They might join uprisings. So all of these little ones are sort of additional adds. And it's just a material chain of stocks, right? It's a new structure, but it's not really bringing anything new to the table in terms of its structure. It's more combining these pieces and components together. And that's really what we're trying to get is you can use these simple structures to combine them together. And it gets you to have, when you start using this concept of micro, meso, and macro, you begin to answer some pretty interesting questions like, what does stability mean? Well, if I know the population in each of those buckets for each civilian segment, for each actor, I can tell you if most of your population is in the coerced, that's not stability, right? That's hanging on a razor's edge. If most of your population's in calculated and governed, that's going to be more stable. But it also has the concept of what is a failing state, right? So the question of stability is looking at the levels of the stock. Where are the people distributed? But is a state failing or not? Well, that's a question of velocity of change, right? How fast is this car accelerating or decelerating? And if you're rapidly moving everyone from the right all the way to the left at a high velocity, that's an indication of a failing state. And that's where we can begin to tease out. Now, these are mainly conflict scenarios because of the work we've done, but we've also talked about doing these for large, um, I don't want to name a name, a large metropolitan transit system that was a regional transit system. And we're looking now at customers of that transit system and stakeholders believing, do I believe it's going to be on time? Do I believe I should pay for the bond for all the repairs? Do I believe the facilities? And this left to right movement, this affiliation and sentiment, it's very similar based on their social identity. If I'm unemployed, do I rely on that public transit or do I not need it as much versus someone who might need it day in and day out to get to school and stuff like that? So you can use these structures in non-conflict examples. Um, an example of what this means when you get down to it is it allows you to create a human terrain map of an area. And this is again from the ISIC example, just to clear the chart. On the left is the y-axis is the extent of population, and the x-axis is where on the map they are. So this is a specific map. An analyst builds a map, and it sort of says percent of the percent of geography from 0 to 100%. So this is a think of taking a map and converting it just to an axis, right? And what it is, it starts in the ISIS area in northeastern Syria and the Anbar provinces. And what these waves are is this is the distribution of the population by size. So you can almost think of this like a terrain, like mountains, right? But it's also envelope. So along the top here, you see ISIS's inner envelope. ISIS originally arose within the Arab Sunni. It actually gained a lot of momentum after Arab Sunnis were repressed by the Arab Shia government, and there were protest camps and things like that. So you think about that legitimacy, that perception of sentiment. The Arab Sunnis were saying we want to participate in government, we want to have more say. The Arab Shia majority government in Iraq was saying no, was pushing it. And you also had the Arab Spring, with the Alawites in Syria. So you have, and again, this is somewhat simplified for those who are very familiar with this, but it's generally Arab Shia denying services and not providing what's needed. When we did this simulation, we're starting straight from the Arab Spring up to the rise of ISIS. But when you see ISIS arise, it's in what we call the inner envelope. It's arising over terrain. If you look here in this lower left, that's mainly orange, that's Sunni Arab. That's a human terrain that is more favorable for ISIS. It's going to be easier for them to take people and move them from coerced to calculated legitimacy, which means they have to spend less effort garrisoning them, preventing uprisings, things like that. It's not saying they were kind or anything like that to the Sunni Arabs. I don't want to give that impression, but it's a terrain that's favorable to them. And again, you can think about different areas. If you're a transit authority, what's the human terrain that's favorable to you? Who's going to be most supportive? Well, as you go to the right, what you see is a change in composition, and this is ISIS's outer envelope. This is now when they're moving out of those Sunni Arabs into areas they might be moving into Kurdistan in the north, the Kurdish areas. They might be hitting those outer envelopes, the outer loops of Baghdad. And what you see, these black lines, these are just simulation runs. So you can kind of think of how far does ISIS get? How far does their conquest go? And the baseline is the baseline. The baseline hysteria, the maximum reach in baseline historical is where they got in reality. So we simulated reality. The baseline without intervention was a counterfactual we did to say, what if there was no intervention? What's the worst case? And you can see they don't just take over all of Syria and Iraq because we have these micro, meso, macro, right? We can track the populations they're moving over and the composition changes as they're doing it and saying, look, it's like a wave going up on a beach and it goes from a sandy area and it starts hitting a rocky area. That wave's not going to just keep going forever. It's going to wear itself out. And in this case, it wore itself out in the outer envelope. And then we were just pointing out there's this great Shia wall, which is this massive spike here that is the line in Syria, in Iraq, Baghdad, Mosul, Basra. These are heavy Shia areas. And obviously, that's a huge difficulty for ISIS. So again, this is just the ISIS example. You can think about this with other examples, creating human terrain maps that, again, at any point you can say, what is the composition of the social identities at play and start doing other things like maybe activists of Sunni Arabs are against ISIS, and therefore you can start playing with some better fidelity and knob turning given the specific case. This is now the Ukraine example, one of the several charts. So post-conflict stabilization, it kind of exposed a strategic paradox. So again, the premise of this experiment is there's been a ceasefire declared on an arbitrary point, the line of control in December. What happens for the next 10 years? So you see here green, that's Ukraine. Red, those are the separatist provinces. And we're looking at their perception that view the actor as legitimate. And the actor here, if you're green, the actor is Ukrainian state. If you're red, the actor is the sort of the occupying regime um, governments there in LNR and DNR. Well, it's interesting. Right after you win the war, perception goes down. And that's kind of counterintuitive. You think about like, hey, we just had, it's a or the war is over, ceasefire. But it's because those services, remember those that socio-technical, you've got a wartime economy where people are like, look, I don't have power, I don't have school, everything's getting shelled. I get it, it's a war. But when the war is over, that perception changes to when are you rebuilding this, right? When am I going to get services restored? And that's that drop. And this model is used, for example, you can use it to say how much funding do they need, what needs to be prioritized. But it's really important to show just as a something you can get when you do this micro, meso, macro, and you can break that out and find out who is actually having the most trouble with services. So you can kind of look at what services do we need to prioritize restoring and rebuilding. Um, this is the hypothetical humanitarian mission in Myanmar 2029. Again, premise here is there's a earthquake out in the ocean, a tsunami hits Myanmar, and this is now the blue line here is the counterfactual of you have the Myanmar population and they have a reconciliation. So the civil war is reconciled here, where the Bamar come together and reconcile their political differences. And then if the civil war continues, that's a counterfactual. So this is just showing a perception viewed as legitimate government under this entire scenario. And you can see here the population has gone down during the conflict and it rises slowly back up after the reconciliation stays low. So you can start doing factuals and counterfactuals, but here you break it out into those meso groups, right? Those civilian segments. Now we're looking, instead of the population of Myanmar, we're looking at the population of those who were pro-junta Bamar originally, those who were anti-junta Bamar originally, and those who are ethnic minorities, all within the control of the state government. And you see there's a lot different. This one clean line can be broken out into a lot more rich detail. So you can still see that split in the counterfactual, but it's a lot lower for the anti-junta Bamar and the ethnic minorities than it is for the pro-junta Bamar. So again, by using these meso factors within a macro context, you can begin to break out a lot of more detail. Um, this is the instability, change in short-term sentiment based on general levels of violence. So you've got, and this is the net instability, this big spike here, that is the tsunami hitting. So we have the ability in the model to do an anomalous event like a natural disaster, because again, we're being asked to model all sorts of things that are left to bang. But this case, the natural disaster hits, you have this immediate loss of housing, right? It kills a lot of people, it removes a lot of housing. You have this mass change of instability and perception, and then what happens to it over it. So this is something that we, again, by doing these, having these, you can now get more information in your scenarios. And the change, this was interesting, the change in sentiment from long-term violence, it shows even if the Bamar reconcile, the ethnic minorities unfortunately still have a lot of violence done against them. And that's again by separating these mesos and micros out, you can get into the complicated of some of these situations that, yeah, you've resolved the civil war, and that just means the majority is once again going against the minority. Some things don't change, and you can represent that if your models are taking these factors into account. So we're about to switch over to the questions here. Again, the benefits, this is all based on existing theory. We are not the theory people here. We rely heavily on Hoggs and Horney and Turnley, and I know Turnley pulled a lot from the legitimacy scholarship. We're trying to bring existing theories in and represent them in simulation structure so that you can use them. And then existing data, right? The data's got to be somewhere. It's got to be, it can't be up in the sky and classified. It's got to be able to represent what you're talking about. We can't say, well, wouldn't it be nice to have this kind of data that doesn't exist? It would, but you got to go with the data you have. So, and it's not complex structures. These structures are all bread and butter system dynamic structures. The demographics and social identity is an aging chain. The sentiment is a double anchor. The affiliation is material chains. These are things you learn pretty simply. It's the way you combine them together that gives you some of this ability to do some of these things. And because and this is probably true in any modeling, right? The usefulness of the model is not how fancy you can get with the model. It's how these things interact together in a complex way to create novel behaviors or unexpected behaviors, or, oh, maybe that's why something's going on. Again, everything we did by the book. There's a 300, 700-page document if you want to read all the confidence tests, unit consistency, conservation of mass, first order control. We did all that. It's available if you want to look at it. You know, all the normal confidence tests you would do with a model in a complex system. We're not saying it's validated, but we're saying it's got a good level of confidence. And it's a big thing with this is we're not trying to make a model for one purpose for one thing. We're trying to make it that you can instantiate it in any part of the world and get this representation of micro, meso, macro, so you can use it in all these different now, again, it's not the one model rule anything. That's a big thing we're trying to conserve. We don't do conventional, right? There's lots of economic stuff that we don't really get into. Like, so you want to be careful that you're not ever making one model rule them all. But you can use these same concepts and use them to build different models or maybe a portfolio of models. In our case, we're looking really at instability and things like that. It has been used in some more business context, but we do try and caveat that it's not meant to be the one solution for everything. But within that context, by getting to this theory that was pretty well established and linking it to data, we're able to do a lot of different cases. And that's been kind of what's interesting as we play around with this and people ask us for the different use cases to use it. So I'll pause here and give time for questions. We can go back, we can slide. I can turn over the control to Jin, but if you want to facilitate the questions, or I'm just happy to take them as they come in. Thank you again.
Thank you, Timothy. This is a longer version of your conference talk, but this is amazing. I see Claudio posted his question or comment on chat a while ago. Would you like to take a look at the chat and then
prior SD? Okay, sorry for missing the especially prior SD models on the subject. The work of Wayne Porter, NPS, and Nosley. How does this model build? So if you go up here, let's see, there's scroll up. Here we go. So this actually has, these are some of the SDM models. And I have, if you look in the papers, we do a full lit review of models at the time. So if you look at Theory of an Emerging State Actor, I think it was published 2018. It goes through what SD models we looked at and how we incorporated them. So, but some of them are captured in here. Like there's an overlap, and that's why I'm going to this. So like a lot of the ones we ran into, we're looking at a very detailed case. We want to be very explicit that we're modeling an actual place with actual people and actual terrain and actual conflict. So like the farmers, bandits, soldiers model, which is a sort of classic system dynamics model, it's abstracted. And it's a very useful abstracted model, but it's meant to display dynamics of shifts between these farmers, bandits, soldiers, which could also be a proxy for insurgencies, heavily abstracted. The Anderson one is the dynamic model of counterinsurgency policy. That is a recreation of the Irish insurgency in the 19 teens and 20s, I think it was. And it's looking at a very specific single case. Again, we're trying to look at all that. So we did go back and look through system dynamics models, but a lot of this was novel work in the Dime Pemesi context. And that's probably because most of the system dynamic models built prior to 2014, 2010, they were not necessarily made in it. And for those not familiar in the military, Dime Pemesi is a class of model that's trying to look at an entire society. I think it's diplomatic information, manufacturing, economic inputs to track political, military, economic, social information and infrastructure outputs, right? It's an acronym that means you're studying a lot of things interacting together. And so a lot of the prior system dynamics models didn't have, if you look at these sectors, we have resources, we have expenses, revenue. So there's a financial part to this. Can they run out of money? Where are they getting their taxation? It's got combat pieces in there. We actually use the RAND situational force scoring as the combat simulator in the heart of this. It's got governance. It's got territory dynamics. It's got all the civilian pieces. So prior system dynamics models didn't have all these pieces together. There's the one infamous one that got splashed across the New York Times. That's never been declassified, so I can't really use it, but it's probably most similar to that one. And that's kind of what we built upon. So again, if you go to 2018 Theory of an Emerging State Actor, there's a full description. And I think on my research grade, I even have one where I go through all the models of war and conflict I could find in sort of like a working draft lit review. But I hope, and Claudio, if I misinterpreted somehow, feel free to ask again. But that's kind of where we're basing this off of.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I suspected you had a very very solid review of prior literature, but I hadn't seen it before. Sorry, I missed that. This is great. I think it marks real progress in the theory and research in this area. And what if I may, there's something that came to mind as you were presenting the demographic aspects together with aspects that have to do with shifts in opinion and support. And what came to mind was what is known as the Hamiltonian perspective in a dynamical system, which in the classical, I mean, if this is a physics idea from mechanics, but in the classical approach, you just look at the existing energy of the system. For example, in terms of the momentum of population and the shifts that are occurring. But in the Hamiltonian perspective, you also examine what potentially could happen, which in this subject matter is as important to analyze, and it's interesting from a scientific point of view, as what is actually happening at any given point in time, right? So in social theory, what could happen is at least as important as what is happening at the moment that the system is being observed. So that Hamiltonian, so-called Hamiltonian perspective is really very appealing in your work, and it might offer additional insights that have a great deal of formal methodology developed already.
Yeah. That's great insight, and I'll take a look at it. My undergrad is in history, not physics, so I will take a look at it. But it's interesting too. So it's by trying not to be the model of everything, we do recognize, and this came up in the conference, right? Social identity itself could be a factor of how people's sentiment shifts. If I'm an activist, my sentiment might shift faster than if I'm a worker because of that social role, that prototyping and process and depersonalization. So, and I didn't really have a great answer there, but so we're looking at, like you said, these broad shifts, and because we can go in the future, you can just do multiple runs and sort of anticipate where they might go. But one of the things we've talked about doing is because we have the hooks in there, you do what's called an entity transfer between models. If you needed to have better use of, like, saying those social identities, because at every day it knows exactly who is where, how old they are, and what their social identity is, and you wanted to get into more detail, say, in that Hamiltonian perspective based on social identity, you can do an entity transfer out, go to some model that better represents that piece, does a calculation and returns the entity transfer back in. This is an example. If you wanted to get a better combat simulator than what we have, we could tell you, look, this is how many tanks, artilleries, and soldiers are in an area. Entity transfer that information out, run the battle in whatever thing you want to run it in that may be higher fidelity than we have, and just tell us what the response is back, and we'll loop it back into the model for the next DT iteration. So I think there's two great ways to explore that, one of which is sort of beyond where this is and sort of recognizes there's a lot more that could be done. Putting in the hooks, I think the starting point is making sure models even represent this. A lot of models I see, at least in system dynamics, they model populations, but they don't model, maybe they have demographics, maybe they have gender, but they don't get into these sort of additional hooks and pieces. And so I think the first thing is to start modeling that way. And then I think you're right, it can really enable some of these different perspectives. And I just have to explain, I kind of laughed at Chris Glasser's point about the coin model that was seen in all its glory. I actually was asked to include it as a citation, and I had to navigate the dance of how do you cite something that's never been declassified? And that gets a little tricky when a reviewer is asking you to include it in your lit review and it's never been declassified. And if you work for the military, that's a no-no. So we just ended up citing the New York Times article about it. But no, great comment, Claudio. And again, there's a lot that can be done this. And we're not trying to say this is a model to do it all, but it's at least an example of when you include these things, you can start doing some of those things, treating it like a physics question. What might happen? What could happen? Playing around with counterfactuals, not just past counterfactuals, but future counterfactuals. What happens in Myanmar if the civil war gets reconciled 3 years from now? What happens to a hypothetical ceasefire if Russia does or doesn't leave their demilitarized zone? Of course, these are all assumptions and guesstimates, and you got to go with experts and make sure they're plausible, but you can begin to explore this kind of counterfactual future forking.
Yeah, I would encourage you to present your work at the next opportunity of the European Social Simulation Association, the next ESSA meeting, because they're always very curious about the modeling that we're doing here in the stateside. And also, if you would like to look up the work of Wayne Porter, he's at the Naval Postgraduate School. If you just in Google Scholar do Wayne Porter System Dynamics, you'll see a great deal of his work coming up. And if you contact him, feel free to mention my name. He's a good friend. And he'd be very, very interested in seeing your work as well.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Oh, Chris.
I got one. Have you shared this with any folks in government?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. So the Project Mead folks, we're doing the counter ISIS modeling. So that was out of the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Low Intensity Conflict Special Operations back when it was CTTSO. So it's now changed acronyms a few times. And then more recently, the Marine Corps Warfighting and Analysis Center. Haven't done it more recently than that. So the latest one was probably 2022, 2021. But we have tried to sort of, make this available and aware. If there's any suggestions, I'll take them online or offline because we're happy to share this work. And it's, it's been funded in part by the government. So they have access to the full documentation somewhere if they want to get it.
Okay. Yeah. I've got some folks in the intelligence community that might be interested. I remember seeing the early versions of your work when you were